Fair warning to those of you who are epileptic or otherwise photosensitive, this game actually features a lot of really bright flashing lights, and it actually gives me a headache at times, even though I'm not that photosensitive. So, fair warning to those of you who are photosensitive, if that bothers you, you probably don't want to watch this review, and you definitely don't want to play the game. Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Superhot for PC, Mac, Linux, and Xbox One. Full disclaimer before I actually start the review proper, I was actually given a review copy of this to take a look at. This is a first-person shooter developed by the Superhot team that was released in February of this year for PC, Mac, and Linux, and saw release in very early May of this year for Xbox One. Its real claim to fame is the idea of time only moving when you do, which does set it apart pretty considerably from every other FPS on the market. That said, it is worth noting as well that the original idea comes from a game jam where they put this thing together in 7 days, and it was a cool idea for that, but it does beg the question of whether or not this is worth a full standalone release that is priced at $25 on launch. So let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out whether or not it actually justifies its price tag. Well, as far as presentation goes, this game really isn't much to look at. They've gone for a very, very minimalist art style where the characters are all red, the environments are all white, your gun in your hand are black, and that's pretty much it. The models are all very blocky and undetailed, as are the animations, and everything's made to look like it's made of glass, basically. There's no real texture quality to speak of because everything is so minimalistic, and when you get down to it, the game just isn't very impressive to look at once you get beyond the particle effects, which do look pretty fantastic, actually. If you use the katana, it dismembers enemies. If you shoot them, they actually start shattering. It's actually a really, really cool effect, and if glass shatters in the game, it looks fantastic as well. And they've made a stylistic choice with regards to the menus to make it look like an old terminal interface, and they also brought along the sound that goes with that, which is actually kind of obnoxious. I mean, seriously, just listen to this. As you can see, the simulated chat bits are perfectly tolerable, but when you get into the so-called loading screens, I guess is the best way to say it, it's just this obnoxious noise that gives you a headache along with that really bright fuzz going on. And that's something else to note about this. As I mentioned before this review started, this game is actually really bright and gives you a lot of headaches if you play it for a long period of time. Hell, I couldn't even play it for longer than about half an hour before I had to actually rest my eyes because it was giving me such a nasty headache at times. It wasn't quite as bad as the Syndicate FPS reboot, but it was pretty close. And once you get past that visual design mixed in with the obnoxious sound with the terminal interface, you find that the sound itself really isn't very good in this game. There's no music to speak of other than the song that plays during the credits, which I actually skipped through the credits purely because the soundtrack for that was actually kind of annoying me. And then there's the voice acting, which can be summed up as this.
Super hot, super hot, super hot, super hot, super hot.
Yep, that is the only voice acting in the entire game. It's pretty annoying after a while. And then there's the sound effects themselves, which there's a lot of glass shattering sounds, there's the sounds of gunfire in slow motion and such like that, and that all works okay, but none of it is particularly impressive. You end up with a game that's ultimately visual style over everything else in terms of presentation, and it does suffer a bit as a result, although it could definitely be a lot worse, let me put it that way. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this starts off relatively innocuous as a game within a game, basically. The idea is that this friend of yours sends you a mysterious game that has just been kind of making the rounds over the net, and you start to play it, only to gradually find out that the game is a bit more than it seems, which it seems to just be some random game about running around blasting a bunch of red guys, which the game even references at a couple of points, but once you start to delve more into the plot and it really starts to unfold, you get this feeling that the developers thought they were being way more clever with it than they actually were. Either that or they were trying to mask the fact that the game is so incredibly short with the fact that the story is told in a rather obtuse manner. It's not hard to digest at all, in fact it's really easy to figure out, but the way it's told eventually gets to the point where it's outright irritating more than it's interesting. Whether they intended it this way or not, the game actually ends up coming across as, look at us, we're being so clever and original and profound, when in reality it's just like, okay, I see exactly what you're going for, but you're kind of shoving it in my face and getting annoying about it. Thus, the game ends up relying more on its gameplay than anything else, and the gameplay is the most interesting aspect of the game because you've got mechanics that you don't really see in any other first-person shooter. Each level is a very, very short series of combat arenas where you're presented with a very specific scenario and you are basically tasked with dealing with that scenario. Every enemy dies in one hit. So do you. The catch is that all of your weapons have limited uses and time only moves when you do, so they say. In reality, it doesn't actually stop when you're not moving, it actually just slows to a crawl when you're not moving, so it gives you plenty of time to react to things. This means that you're basically trying to move projectiles into targets, and you're trying to gradually dodge projectiles as you move along. It's a pretty interesting idea, and it is actually pretty entertaining for all of a few levels before it actually starts to get incredibly frustrating. They gradually ratchet up the difficulty, which is perfectly fine until you realize that it's basically just trial and error. The entire game is down to nothing more than trial and error. You have to memorize where the enemies are going to come from. You have to memorize how they're going to attack you. You have to memorize exactly where they're going to be at which particular time in order to actually be able to deal with them. And while there is some degree of skill involved in actually being able to lead projectiles and such like that, it really just comes down to repetition because you can repeat the level as many times as you want, and because they're incredibly short, the game basically encourages you to keep playing those levels over and over and over again until you get it right, and not only until you get it right, until you've basically mastered it. It's the same kind of idea that Hotline Miami has, but in Hotline Miami it's executed a bit better because you have a lot more situational awareness. In this, you basically have to just constantly swivel your head around until you realize that an enemy's right in your face and is going to instantly kill you. And there are also times when the game's just gonna blindside you or throw you into a completely unfair scenario, like in the elevator, for example. I lost count of the number of times I had to repeat that, and the sad part is, even with the amount of repetitions I had to do in order to actually be able to complete the levels, the game was still only about an hour and a half long. It is a ludicrously short game. And even though they introduced the idea of hot switching later on in the game where you can jump between bodies, it still gets incredibly repetitive incredibly quickly. It becomes incredibly obvious that the entire game is just one big gimmick, and that's okay if it's a game jam game. That's kind of what you expect from them. It's an opportunity for them to experiment and try something new, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But when they start to release them as a full standalone game, when it's this short and there's so little content to it, I mean, you've got the main story mode, you've got endless mode, which is just basically as it sounds. You end up going up against basically an endless horde of enemies until finally you die. And then there's the challenge mode, which allows you to go through a bunch of different scenarios where you might be able to go through with only your fists, or you might not be able to restart, or you might have to beat a timer or something along those lines. But those two modes are only unlocked when you've finished the game, and when you've finished the game, you've basically gotten tired of it. It's definitely a very cool proof of concept, but once you try to move beyond that, once you try to look into this thing as more than simply a proof of concept that is a really cool idea, then it starts to just fall apart because it's really just a gimmick when you get down to it. It is the gimmick of, oh hey, time only moves quickly when you actually start moving around. But that can only get you so far. It's like with the wall walking in Prey. That is only so far. It's the level design that makes that game a lot more interesting than simply, oh, you can walk on walls and there's portals to different parts of the world. Here you're basically in for an hour to an hour and a half of a gimmick with a lot of
super hot, super hot.
thrown in for good measure. And considering the reception this thing got, where there were just tons of 9s, 9.5s, 10 out of 10s, 5 out of 5s, whatever they may well be, people throwing around, oh, it's the most innovative shooter in years, and so on and so forth, I just have to wonder, did we play the same game? Because sure, that gimmick is actually really cool and different, but once you get past that, the game is just not particularly great. In fact, it's just pretty underwhelming. When you consider all the hype it got, it's just an underwhelming release that is kind of interesting for a while. It'd probably be worth picking up if you get it on sale for cheap, but I just can't recommend it for full price. Not in the slightest. Ultimately, it gets a 2.5 out of 5. Again, it's a cool concept, it's just that I wish there was more game there to speak of, as opposed to an hour and a half that's being charged $25 for. And while the developers have said that they are working on new content that will get released for free, in its current state, I just can't really recommend it. Maybe after the new content drops and there's more game to speak of, but until then, it's a 2.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.